All right, good afternoon everybody. Kia ora koutou. My name's Sean Ewan, as it says on the big screen. I have the pleasure of facilitating this fabulous panel session. And I start in light of the wonderful events of the last few weeks and pay my respect to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people. I think if I turn this way I go quiet, which could make some people very happy. And in the light of 65,000 years of development, we might call the referendum just a blip. My mother's country is Ngambri Country in the Western Districts of Victoria, and for those of you who don't know, I spent pre-pandemic the 20 years at the University of Melbourne, in the last few years as Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous, and I'm delighted to be back at my 10th Lyme connection and to be in the warm embrace of this community. And I recall with some fondness actually the U2 concert after the last Lyme in Christchurch. And who knew, March, April of 2020, that we would be looking back at that concert thinking, wow, that would have been a fabulous super spreader event with the warmth and the singing and the packed in amount of people, and we hope that we would get back to those kind of events and indeed these kind of gatherings. We're going to have a discussion on decolonising higher education, and we've been prompted by the fabulous keynote this morning, Professor Tuck, and thinking about some of our own theories of change. We won't stick slavishly to that. We'll talk about decolonising higher education, but we don't want to sit and simply admire the problem. I think most of us have a fair sense of what some of those challenges might look like. And the reason that I mentioned briefly my previous 20 years before my current role, which is at Griffith University as Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education, is moving from an Indigenous specific role in higher education to a non-Indigenous specific role responsible for education across the institution. Taken to conversations with, and we'll hear more from her tonight, Professor Paparangi Reid, around Bell Hook's margins to centre, and thinking about where you can most affect change, and is it that on the margins or at the centre. And one of my learnings when I started at Griffith was my Vice-Chancellor said to me, Sean, you've spent most of your career raging against the machine, now you are the machine. And so you need to think about how you affect your agency in that context. I'm not sure if that was a good thing or not, but we're still working on that. Enough from me. We probably won't get to questions today because we've got such a fabulous panel. We've got a few things that we want to talk about. We're going to introduce ourselves and perhaps have a reflection on what we might have seen that fits in with examples of decolonising higher ed that we might have seen. And then we're going to have a bit of a think about what processes might help us think through what that actually means, and then time travel to about 2050 and say, okay, what might be the outputs, the impacts, or the reformed set of relationships, and referring on from Professor Tuck's work this morning, that those different processes might reveal to us. So this is part of our own approach to thinking about the fabulous prompts this morning around, in my sense, theories of change, but some of my panel members have said, Sean, that's way too academic. You might want to think about that a bit differently. So enough from me. Thank you for joining us in the post-lunch session, and I'll hand over now to Renata.
Kia ora tātou katoa, te me tuatahi ki te mahi ki ngā tangata whenua ki tēnei rohe, te Ngunnawal and Ngambri. Tangata kei konei, ko waiau, nā toki ma te whaurua, te waka, hokianga te waiora, tāpapa, te awa, mga muka te whenua, karangapuhi te ingoa whānau, no tainoi hoki ahau, ki te tahataku pāpā, no he tauiwi ia. I'm Renata Watene. I hail from a background from the northern part of Aotearoa. I whakapapa tū Ngāpuhi, and I also whakapapa tū Tainoi. And then I also obviously have Pākehā heritage. My father was adopted and, well, actually orphaned, was unfortunately left on a doorstep, and we don't know what our background is on that side, but we suspect it's back to Irish or Scottish ancestry, so I always say I have a good drinking hand and a good fighting one, and I don't know which one belongs to which. I come from a background of actually a lot of trauma from university. I grew up in a very, very strong whānau environment, went and lived overseas in a country that didn't speak English, learnt another language, but they fundamentally had Māori core principles that they lived by. So I went to Argentina, so didn't really experience the culture shock that everyone had anticipated that I would experience. Came back, went to university, went to good old med school, and at that point, optometry, which is now my career, wasn't part of the MAPAS program that we have. And that was the very first place where I experienced culture shock, and did not realise it at the time, did not realise it until after I graduated and after I left university, feeling like a very broken, non-valuable person. So what do I do now? I'm an optometrist. I own a couple of my own clinics. I have several governance roles, and I've worked, for those of you that know the New Zealand health system, I was a ministerial appointment to the Waitemata DHB until it was dissolved last year. They asked for expressions of interest to Te Ako Whaiora, and I chose not to put my hat in the ring for that because I felt that they weren't going to give it the mana that it deserved with resourcing, human and otherwise. And unfortunately, that proved to be true. And then my role at the university is I am the kaiawhina, the very first Māori professional teaching fellow at the School of Vision Science. And I have recently just decided to jump into doing my PhD. So depending on what day of the week you ask me, I am doing different things.
Hello everyone, Eddie Cubillo. I'm a Larrakia, Wajigan and Central Islander man from the Northern Territory. Just want to acknowledge country, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. My background is I practiced law for a while, and then firstly I had kids at 20 years of age, so I went back as a mature age student if I was going to tell my kids to get educated, I thought best I get some education, and ended up in law after studying social work first, and got told I was probably in the wrong area because I was too argumentative. And so I did law, and so I practiced law for a little while, and then in the Northern Territory, 85% of the prison population is Indigenous. So I really wanted to have a say on making some real change. So I put my hand up to go on the former voice, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission. And for me, I thought that was an avenue where I could have voice my strong feelings in regards to what's happening for my people. And I ended up being the chair, which was really interesting. We had a council of 13, 9 were women, and for some strange reason they wanted me to be the chair. So it was a real interesting dynamic, and I look back now on ATSIC and I see a whole heap of things that hadn't been discussed on the lead up to the referendum, and one of those for me was the ability to be on a regional voice where you could listen to your elders guide you and explain to you around the governance and the decision-making processes. If you know the makeup of the territory, it's fairly dynamic, with nations still really practicing culture and languages, and so that helped guided me to really develop my skills in not only an Indigenous space but also in a white structure, but also have an influence and discussions with Indigenous peoples from all around Australia, and learning their nation ways of governing and decision making. So that was really influenced on me in regards to how I go about dealing with, how I do with the education at the current time. But so I also then went and became the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner of the Northern Territory. I did that for a while, and then I ended up running the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service, and I then worked on the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory on out-of-home care and juvenile justice, which was really, really interesting and really conjured up a lot of the stories that I heard previously from my elders in regards to child removal and various other traumatic incidents that affect all our Indigenous people in this country. That was a really intense year of a Royal Commission, which is pretty short in comparison to others, which I was burnt out after that, and I wrote a piece that I wanted to get published, and distinguished Professor Larissa Brent said, you only need 4 more and you got a PhD, so so I laughed, but she's pretty persistent, and I ended up doing a PhD, and then I ended up at Melbourne Law School.
Thank you. Hello everyone, my name's Kelly Menzel. I'm a proud Ngadjuri woman from the mid-north of South Australia, and I have ancestral connections to the Bundjalung Nation in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, which is where I live. I'd like to acknowledge country and the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Thanks for having me here, but I'd also like to acknowledge all Indigenous people in the room and non-Indigenous people in the room. So I am currently the Associate Dean of Education at the Ngambri College of Indigenous Australian Peoples at Southern Cross University. I found myself accidentally in that role. I applied for a job, and the first day I turned up, that was the gift that was given to me. So I didn't realise it was the gift that came with the job. So I actually really love working in the space that I'm in. But the reason I'm a nurse by trade, and my mum got pregnant with me when she was doing year 12, and she decided to go to university with me when I was a baby. And so I remember being very tiny and running up and down the halls of the university that I later went to, and it smelt exactly the same as it did when I was 3. But I did nursing. My mum and dad are both teachers, and they very strongly encouraged me, don't ever become a teacher. So I went into nursing because an elder told me that I would be a good nurse, and I wasn't going to ignore the advice of the elder. And so I did nursing, and I found myself in teaching really quickly, because I moved into education, into higher education. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to work overseas. I worked in London for 7 years at a university that had a widening participation policy. So I worked with a lot of First Nations peoples from Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And the women particularly welcomed me with open arms, far more than the staff did. And I learnt so much from these women. They gifted me with so much. And you spoke about culture shock. I've never experienced culture shock like it, divided by a common language. When I moved to the UK, it took me 2 years to learn how to speak English in England. But when I came home from the UK, I was the same. I was really burnt out. It took a lot out of me. And I decided that I wanted to go and work in my own community. And so I started working for the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council in New South Wales. And I was fortunate enough that I was able to practice, but I was also able to do education. And I spent a lot of time in AMSs and Aboriginal community control, just learning from some amazing health workers and health practitioners. And it led me back to university, and that's where I started my PhD. So I did the same, PhD by prior publication. It was pretty intense, but it's enabled me to be able to now give back to my community. And being able to live on country for me is, I've only recently moved to Bundjalung Country, and it's been transformative. So that's a really important part, I think, of being able to live on country and practice with community has been a really important thing for me.
Thank you. Hi folks. My name's Vicki Kerrigan. My heritage is Anglo-Celtic Irish, so I am a white settler coloniser sitting on this panel. Feeling a bit nervous about it. Thank you very much to the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people for having us here in this beautiful country. I grew up on the lands of the Wonnarua, about 5 hours north of here. Settlers, colonisers call it the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. I now live on Larrakia Country, where Eddie's family's from, Ian Lee's family's from. I've lived on Larrakia Country for the last 15 years. That has been where most of my growth has occurred as a white settler coloniser. I used to work for ABC Radio. I was in a session yesterday where people were talking about the deficit narratives and the racist stereotypes that the media perpetuates. I was a part of that for 20 years. I told those stories for a very long time. The last kind of 5 years of my career at ABC Radio took me on a different journey where I started to do a master's and I started to critically reflect on how we as colonisers contribute to racist narratives and how we need to change the stories that we tell. I moved into research. I work at Menzies School of Health Research now. I'm an intercultural communication researcher. The key to intercultural communication, which I think us white people miss out on a lot, is we don't examine our own culture. And so that's a part of the decolonising process, that we also need to recognise that whiteness is a culture and we need to be looking at that, not just expecting other people to tell us about their culture. I did a PhD, which was on intercultural communication, looking particularly at how healthcare providers work with First Nations patients at Royal Darwin Hospital. And I think one of the things that really kind of made me realise, other than of course the support that I get from so many of my First Nations colleagues to say, no, white people do have a place here, come on, you can do this. Paulo Freire, the philosopher and the educator, I always remember this. He said that the descendants of the colonisers and the descendants of the colonised both have a role here to transform the society that we live in, but we have to do it in partnership and we have to do it together. So my role as a descendant of the colonisers is different to other people's roles. And I'm still learning what that role is, and hopefully I'll learn more today.
Awesome, thanks all. Eve also talked about place and the specificity of place. And I think about place, and we've heard this on the panel already, we can frame it as physical or geography. We think through the disciplines, so we've got optometry, law, education, nursing, journalism and comms. We could think about epistemological place, how those would drive different understandings of place. So I want to ask anyone from the panel that wants to have a go, what examples, given that we actually have a topic we're supposed to talk about, decolonising education across the tertiary sector, what examples would you draw on that you've seen in the past that actually would be good examples of decolonising, and in particular with reference to the own range of places that you've mentioned?
I've got to...
Go for it, Kelly.
I knew the question was coming because you gave us a heads up. So I literally, overnight, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm like, oh, I can use this as an example. I had the privilege last week of being able to take a couple of PhD students on a writing retreat. I'm a co-supervisor, and with the principal supervisor, we were able to do that. And they were very, very stuck in their PhDs. It's a very normal thing to experience, but we decided it was a strategy to try and get them unstuck so that we can move them forward. And we tried everything. We had guest speakers speak to them. We, had dinner. We did all this stuff. But I think the most transformative session that we had was we sat around. We were in the Gold Coast hinterland, so you would think warm, but it was really cold. And so we had this lovely fire going, and we were sitting around weaving. I've been fortunate to be gifted the weaving in a particular way from a Bundjalung elder, and she's given me permission to be able to teach other people this particular weaving. And of course we all brought all different activities to do and craft to do when we sat around and we did some weaving together and just talked about methodology and talked about our worldviews and talked about relationships and talked about their studies and their fears and their concerns, and yarned, in this really fluid, natural way. And it helped them be able to put some of their worries and concerns into perspective. And we also produced some really beautiful pieces of, art as part of that they took home with them. And I felt like that was way more meaningful not just for them, but it was reciprocal. It was just as meaningful for us in how we can support them as students, but also them sharing their knowledges and language and skills with us just as much. And could never have done that in any classroom or any university. And I think that I would do that again in a second.
Thanks, Kelly. Any other examples?
Yeah, look, I was doing my PhD and I was talking to my non-Indigenous supervisor and I was saying it's difficult to, I was writing about the Aboriginal legal services and whether, is self-determination possible for them. And I was saying that someone who came through the Aboriginal legal services as a young board member and then a chair, and then who was inspired then to go on and to do law. You see all the historics around community control and the relationships that are built on that journey. And the Aboriginal Legal Services is the oldest, one of the oldest community control organisations in the country, and a lot of relationships were forged, and battles, were won and lost, and some of those relationships are very, tenuous and so when you're getting that information, when you're redoing your research and interviewing people, how you ask the questions and how you record that is one difficult way of doing that. People come to you because they trust you, and I was trying to explain this to this non-Indigenous person and saying, this person knows you, you've been in this journey for 25 years, but you also know the politics behind it all, and how you record it, and then the other issues and how you write it, because you don't want to damage those relationships that have been thrived over the journey of the fight for our people's rights. And any misrepresentation could damage everything of those family relationships or that community relationships, and that's really important to us as Indigenous people. We want to make sure that we respect that, and we know that because we've grown up in that community. But he couldn't understand that. He just thought that we needed to write what was given without understanding the historical premise behind it all, and the things people gave up to get there, and so there was a huge debate between myself and him. But I think what I really wanted to go to was the next stage. I was asked at Melbourne University to come and speak to PhD students, and when I looked around the room, there was predominantly coloured faces, and we had non-Indigenous people talking about all the things they thought were the most important. And so I raised what I just spoke about, and everyone in the room, all the black faces were all just nodding, right, and they got it straight away. And I think I then had to have a session with all the non-Indigenous academics to explain what I was trying to get across in regards to the respect that for Indigenous people, it's not just recording the messages, but then how do we put it down on paper and making sure that we respect that unspoken things that have happened on that journey without affecting those relationships.
So we've started with the light topics of, what pedagogies are legitimated and what research methodologies we accept in the academy. Renata?
Look, I think fundamentally, if we're talking about a tertiary institution, we need to start by recognising our own mātauranga and our own knowledge-based systems, and actually the way in which we view them is very different in an Indigenous worldview. We don't own that information. It's not ours to gift away. It belongs to our ancestors, it belongs to our tupuna, but it actually also belongs to our future generations, and it's about looking after that information so it can be, have the mana or the life essence that it holds, and it can be grown and then gifted on to keep on giving. So fundamentally, the way that we look at knowledge is very different. So we need to start at that point because that's what our institutions are about. The next thing is that, and it's a very optometrist answer, you cannot be what you cannot see. So we need leadership. You know, if we want to talk about Indigenous, and we talk about decolonisation, but let's even change that. Let's talk about re-Indigenisation. We need leadership. And part of that we've spoken about, there's burnout. There's a very limited resource of people that you can draw upon, and there is a limited capacity that they can do. So actually, what does sustainability look like for those people, for those projects, for those different workflows? So then when we get asked to go and do cultural safety competency training, actually is that the most important thing? Is the first thing that we need to do upskilling our other staff members who are already in the 1% that are doing really, really well in the world? Or do we need to go and use our mātauranga and our leadership to be able to go back and elevate the voices of the community, which ultimately we're trying to make a change. We're trying to make transformational change across this ecosystem. And arguably, if you look at our cultures, we know how to do that. We know how to live in harmony with our world. We know how to live and respect nature, live with nature, and we know how to have observational science. We know how to, we are scientific by nature. We circumnavigated the globe. We lived in harsh terrains, and we did this for millennia. So we have inherent knowledge that must be respected because it's actually the thing that's going to ultimately wind up saving everyone. So it's about changing the way that we view all of those things. And I think the only other thing I would add is that, you know, our core Indigenous principles, we need to, if tertiary education systems are going to take those on board, then they have to live by those principles. They can't just put them in a strategic document and then forget about them. If you're going to take those things and take the mātauranga and take the knowledge and take all of the work that our ancestors and our children are putting into all of those things, then you must respect it for what it is and actually live those principles. Otherwise, do not start there.
I'll come back to some of those things in a minute. Vicki?
Whew. I might just pick up just to be, you know, white and linear. On
Space for everybody.
Yeah, thanks. It's so, yeah, it's really humbling to be listening to all of this. But just something that Eddie was talking about in terms of, you know, the research and stuff. So all of the research I do obviously is it's in collaboration, it's co-design, and I should actually, you know, Ani Billawarra Lee, Ian's sister, was one of my PhD supervisors, other people who have been an incredible part of my research work, Ratchawoi Melanie Herdman, who is a Yolngu leader, Stuart Yuan McGrath, who is currently, you can cheer for him actually, if you like. He is currently finishing his nursing placement at Alice Springs Hospital. He's going to be the first Yolngu nurse ever. Yeah, go on, why not? He should have been here, actually. So I just wanted to mention those people because they are obviously a part of my own journey to decolonise my mind, or to try to do that, which will take forever. But I actually really appreciated what Professor Tuck was talking about this morning when she was talking about participatory action research as something that's normal. And I think that in the health space in particular, and in the biomedical health space, qualitative research and participatory action research or Indigenous research methodologies are very much, have been traditionally undervalued. Obviously not here at an event like this, but I think as a white person, participatory action research, which aligns so beautifully with a lot of the Indigenous methodologies that you guys use naturally, that's a really important thing for me to continue to advocate for, particularly in this health space, and to push back on that biomedical reductionist approach that I'm often asked, where is the quantitative data? And as an ex-journalist, I know that there is power in stories because I contributed to the negative stories, and now I try to contribute to more strengths-based stories.
And as Ian Anderson, who I think spoke in the last day or so, was recently in the media about talking about the oral history of his people aligning with what we now know about the change to our climate over millennia as well, and those historic oral histories are quite legitimate, and I don't think they need the other science to be legitimated either. But you all talked about it in different ways, so I want to come to a different kind of question. What would you see as changes needed? You don't want a strategy that has some nice words, and I know that Auckland has a nice strategy with some nice words. what governance and processes would you argue that we might want to change or enhance that sustain agency, Indigenous agency, and or that sustain community in terms of you want to co-create and so on. So I'm really thinking about governance and processes in higher ed or in tertiary sector that you might want to say, let's ramp that up a bit or let's ramp that down a bit.
So many things.
One will do.
Yeah, there's no elevator pitch for that, is there? It's a plethora of things that need to occur. Seeding the space, I think, is really important, and by that I mean we definitely need non-Indigenous people working alongside us and with us, but we also need non-Indigenous people to seed the space when appropriate, so that our leaders who have the skills and the knowledge, the cultural PhDs as well as the westernised PhDs, to be able to rightfully step into that space, so that we then can succession plan. We are able to plan for 7 generations forward, for however many generations it is, so that it far outlives us, and so that our children behind us can see through that white concrete ceiling that at the moment I can't. I don't even know what the rarefied air looks like above me. So that space needs to be seeded for us to be able to step into it.
Yeah, I think going straight off of that point is absolutely, there needs to be empowering, but there also needs to be depowering within those spaces. I think a few people who might have heard me speak, I talk about unicorns being those Indigenous people that everyone, you've got to have all these things and all these, and I'm like, those don't exist in non-Indigenous people, and then you want them to be Indigenous too. It's kind of like, it's really hard to find these people. And then I talk about allies being like zebras. You know, we've got these people that are aspiring to be special and unique, because unicorns are, and they've got the blackfellow stripes because they're really wanting to be involved, but they will still never ever be unicorns. So there are times and spaces where you need to understand who you are and where you are, and you need to be able to recognise what your position is, and there is absolutely a position for those people. A group of unicorns, by the way, is called a blessing, and a group of zebras is called a dazzle, and a group of horses, who are the people who aren't doing anything, are called a herd. So don't be part of the herd, be part of the dazzle, or be part of the blessing. But yeah, it's trying to create the space, but realising like that the idea, but in New Zealand there's this big conversation about co-governance, and this idea that co-governance, so you're going to lose something within it, and it isn't. It's about coexisting, it's about partnership.
It's good for everyone.
Yeah, and it's about seeing two sides of something so that you can actually live together, because that's ultimately what we want, is to be able to live and work and coexist together for a bigger goal, ultimately.
For me, it's just coming from a legal perspective, basic respect, I think. The reality is I'm only new to the world of academia, and there are all these standards that you're judged before you even walk in the door. I've never been to a sandstone uni in my life, and some of the gradings that they don't respect the 25 years I've had working at the coalface in their own system and working with my people, and so that's not accounted for when speaking in classrooms. But the year I've had, and the discussion we had yesterday coming from the students really highlight what the teaching students want, and it's what us as Indigenous people provide, that basic nurturing and respect and sharing that we don't judge as well. And I think at these, we all go through life and the things are really difficult, and being a top 3% maybe one standard, but the reality is getting through is the big thing, right? And then once you get into the world of whatever you're going to become a professional in, it's whether you can relate to your client and who you're working with. And I think that's when you start to realise what it's all about. And students who are, most of them are pretty sheltered where I'm working. They've never been hungry or worried if the power's going to be on when they get home and all that sort of stuff. So they really have no understanding of what Australia is going through. And like, I think just common respect, empathy, humility and humanity is not taught in academia. And I think that's a big plus that Indigenous people bring to these institutions. And it's really sad when you sit in the classrooms and you read or understand where students are coming from. And I think that's the big void that I think Indigenous people bring to the environment. And I think that is shown us yesterday. For me, that's why I've stayed whilst being attacked. So hearing the students, and then I was saying to Sean previously that put on a bit of kilos because students are dropping off biscuits and you know,
It would be rude not to take them.
Yeah, all sorts of things, you know, saying you know, thank you and please don't go and all that sort of stuff. I'm not saying that here just to pump myself up, but that's, you know, when you're laying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's what makes you stay. And it's not the Indigenous kids, it's you know, the Asian kids. Most recently I had a Palestinian student come knocking on our door and really want to ask how our resilience and how do we continue on every time we get a knockback. And obviously it's not in the same circumstances, but you know, it really reinforces what you're doing in these environments is actually working. And despite, you know, our knowledge, we share our knowledge. It's just part of who we are. The field is about hoarding the knowledge and making sure that you're ostracised and that you're not regarded as an expert more than they are. So I think those are some of the confrontational things, but I think that's, as an Indigenous person, what we bring to these environments.
Thanks, Eddie. Vicki?
I'm thinking about how in my culture, in white culture, we value qualifications that have been given to us by mainstream institutions over relationships, and how that just perpetuates the, can I swear?
Yes.
The shit show that we've created.
She did it, now we all can.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
And I'd really love us to stop focusing on qualifications and to start focusing on relationships. Because what I have learnt is when you focus on relationships and when you give and when you do participate in the reciprocity that is required, when you have authentic relationships, then you can change the systems. That's when you have trust. That's when you can change the systems. And the people who are gracious enough to put up with me and to work with me, we make changes because of the relationships that we have, not because of the qualifications. And I'm also tired of mainstream institutions referring to the people who share their wisdom with me as cultural advisors. I think that it is really tokenistic, and I'd really just like that phrase to stop. Because these people are not just cultural advisors, they are professors within their own cultures and within their own nations, and every nation should be recognising them in that way.
And is there anything that the panel want to pick up in terms of the conversation or the examples that are being given?
Can I just add to what you were just saying about, you know, decency, and everyone's touched on it. If we build those relationships with our colleagues, not just with our students, but with our colleagues, particularly in the academy, and humanise each other, we're less likely to harm each other as well. And so much harm goes on in universities. But if we see each other as human beings, as fully fledged emotional experiences and things like that, we are less likely to harm each other. We're more likely to have relational experiences and reciprocity and sharing and respect. Only good things can come from that, right?
I hope so.
I probably just wanted to add that from a governance point of view, we have this short-term thinking crutch, And actually, again, if you apply Indigenous knowledge, we've got long-term intergenerational views of living. So we're not actually thinking about the next 5-year strategic plan. So when we talk about, like in my business, I'm talking about changing the system, transforming optometry so that the, inequities that my grandmother and my grandfather experience, when my children are elders, that they are not experiencing the same thing. So I'm not talking about what I'm going to do in 5 years. I'm talking about success looks like them not experiencing the same levels of deprivation and inequality. So we've actually got to take that longer intergenerational view of how we view ourselves, because that by default gives us sustainability, and it breaks things up and makes things more achievable as well.
There's a theme that's emerging for me, and I have a colleague at Stellenbosch, Professor Pumla Godobo-Madikizela, and she was a Truth Commissioner on the South African Truth Commission between 94 and 98. And I was talking to her at one day saying, blah, blah, in my arrogant way, Hannah Arendt talks about the impossibility of forgiveness for some crimes. And I'm not saying tertiary education's a crime, but we're talking about relationality and so on. She said, no, Sean, you're all wrong. So I ordered another coffee. And she said, so she's doing some work, and she, as I said, her Truth Commissioner work is important. She's a professor of historical memory and trauma. She's got a collaborative project with Queen's Belfast, and in fact, she argues that in terms of, what were the unicorns called?
Unicorns?
The collective.
Oh, the blessings.
The blessings. So I'll get to them in a minute, it's just in my head. She argues that to get past, for conflict to move on, you might need some unicorns to move the horses and so on out of the way. But actually a notion of solidarity is where she's landed. And as a Truth Commissioner and the South African Truth Commission very focused on forgiveness and reconciliation, in Australia we use language of reconciliation quite a lot. I'm not sure how much currency that will have for some time now. Treaties being discussed at different states and looking what's happening over in New Zealand as well. But actually the notion of solidarity, which is based on what you've all talked about actually, which is relationality and relationships and futures for our kids and our kids' kids and our kids' kids' kids. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that in terms of how you think about navigating the tertiary sector, how you think about frameworks that help us think forward rather than just reconciliation or forgiveness or a good old fight and whatever else. Vicki, you've gone last all the time and I feel sorry for you.
Oh no, I'm really happy to go last. The thing that I see missing in a lot of the conversation is the critical reflection on white culture. I see white people always outwardly looking and asking for the solutions to the problems that we've created. Taika Waititi, I don't know if anybody saw this video that he did. Did anyone see? There was this video, it was hilarious, where he'd been asked to go. Taika Waititi, everybody knows who he is. Yes, excellent. If you don't, please educate yourself.
Awfully handsome.
Awfully handsome. Very funny. But he had been asked to, talk at a diversity, solving racism problem, and he stood there and he's like, I didn't create this, you people created it. You let me go and be a filmmaker. And that brings me back to this point of, when are we going to learn about what we did? Like, when are we going to critically investigate the whiteness in healthcare? When are we going to critically, like, how can we actually decolonise the colonial system if we don't understand the colonial system? We need to really look at the colonial system that we've created and critically reflect on that. And we need to know, like part of, our team have developed training, which isn't a part of the education, well, it's part of education. It's delivered to healthcare providers at Royal Darwin Hospital, and we're looking at Gove and Catherine hospitals as well. But part of it is saying to people, that race is a social construct. And not just saying it, but then showing them the pictures of the You know, Carl Linnaeus, the race maker, the botanist who created racial categories that exist today, like show people the actual faces of the white men who created this thing that we now still use. So we need to become racially literate, and I think that that would be a really great thing to see within higher education, is actually becoming racially literate. I think part of the problem that we failed with the referendum is we don't have racial literacy. The majority of us don't, the colonisers don't.
I think also I teach a lot of students Indigenous knowledges and a lot of different health workers how to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly in southern Queensland, which has the largest population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And a lot of the workers look at me like I'm never going to work with an Aboriginal person, so why do I have to do this particular unit? And it's like, you live in southern Queensland, you are absolutely going to have a client who's Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So you have to have these discussions, but then we go into those discussions around racial literacy and the discomfort that people experience talking about whiteness and racism and all of those things. And it is absolutely necessary to be uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's the point of change. Change is not meant to be easy or smooth or comfortable or soft. It just isn't. So getting past white guilt and white shame is really important so that people can move forward and get comfortable at having dinner table conversations at, you know, on your date about these things. It needs to be everyday conversations. That's part of that literacy. We're yet to do that. We're yet to have a reckoning. And I think that that's a really important part of it.
I went to Melbourne University, and after 6 months I ended up on the executive, and I was wondering what I was doing there, and I just felt, and I said to them, this is probably one of the most unculturally safe place I've ever worked, you know, and I've worked in courts, corrections, everywhere, and they were horrified that I said that, and I just said, oh. And then COVID came, and then so we dropped the discussion, which I'll give them grace because of COVID, and then I end up in this huge racial incident, and so now we're doing the cultural safety review that I initially asked them to do. And I think our students, they teach so much, right? Our Indigenous and our non-Indigenous students, who I bring into their classroom, you know, Indigenous people from all walks of life and experts in their fields. And I brought a lady in from a town camp in Alice Springs, and who'd been at the forefront of the intervention, and, you know, for those who don't know, it's a real racial policy where they suspended the Racial Discrimination Act to bring all these racial policies in that only were aimed at Indigenous people. And she has no formal qualifications other than basically doing it, or being to the UN and, you know, to the courts in regards to fighting for rights and all that. And the discussion after, I think, really highlights that students couldn't believe that our First Nation person in a town camp could do all of this, and where did she find the time to also then look after her 5 kids and fight for the rest of the country in regards to its rights at the UN. And I think that really brought to them this feeling that obviously they're not getting taught what they should be getting taught in these places, and I think that really opened up their minds. And I think our classes are generally small, but the grapevine is big, and I think the 300 students that were out the front of the university pushing change, I think is the key for us to really make some differences in these places.
Yeah, I think probably the only thing that I would add as well is we have a real big danger of it falling into a coloniser and an Indigenous argument, and we have to remember that there's a huge population that doesn't belong to either one of those, and that's actually a voice that still needs to be part of the conversation. If you look at take health for example, if you look at our health makeup, they make up a majority of our population that we're talking about, and they feel like they are not part of the conversation. They feel like it's a them problem. And so we actually need to empower them to be educated and understand as well, because I know in a lot of my spaces where I am absolutely the minority, I always hear the conversation, oh, well, what about my culture? And I'm like, well, you can always go home. This is my home. I can't choose to be from somewhere else. So we have to include them in the conversation as well, because as you referred to, we have students, and those students need to understand that they are part of the bigger picture and part of the solution, and it's not a black and white conversation. Yeah. It is actually much bigger than that, and that it's back to living together and that long-term intergenerational view of how we do things.
So we're just warming up, but we have not very much time left. In closing, we said we would do this. 7 generations from now, what do you see as some of the impacts, outputs of reform set of relationships in terms of the tertiary sector? What kind of outcomes, outputs, relationships can we expect to see with a blessing of unicorns pushing out the herd of horses in the nicest possible way?
Not having to have panels like these.
Aren't you enjoying yourself?
I think I think if you push it out that many generations, I want my children to be able, and my grandchildren and their grandchildren, to be able to get up and go to work or do what they want to do because they can, not because they've got barriers. I want them to be able to go and get a degree and just do their job, or just do what it is that they want to do to fulfill themselves as a human being. We naturally have an act of service that's inherent, it's built into us, and we will always give back to our own and to nature, and to make sure that we can sustain our life force here on earth. But I want them to just be able to be authentically themselves without having to justify or support or have to do things for other people just to merely exist. It would have been awesome to just go to university and get a job and worry about my mortgage and my, kids and what holiday I'm going to go on to next. But the reality is, for an Indigenous person, it's not like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think you shouldn't have to be on 32 committees or something at university, or think you're doing law you're going to save our people. Majority of our people who do law or something know the numbers and have family in and out of the correctional facilities and really think that they're going to really make some change. And they'll learn after first year law that's just not going to happen. And they decide whether it's been a waste of a year or what else can they do. And I just think, I think that burden shouldn't be placed on anyone, that they got to save our own mob. And I haven't practiced law for 10 years, but I still get phone calls asking for legal advice on everything, and I think that's incumbent on our nations that force that upon us. And I think, for me, if our kids can just go to law or go to medicine and just do what everybody else thinks about.
Yeah, be a doctor, not the Indigenous doctor. Yeah. Be the optometrist, not a Maori optometrist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I get this image in my mind of a less high-rise, more low democratic kind of feeling. For me, that place is brought into universities, that we acknowledge the country, sky, sea, land into the university, Doesn't matter where we are, country is everywhere. And for me, that would be a really important thing to be included in not just this sector. I think that the academy intersects with so many sectors because we're, educating people, that any changes in the tertiary sector is going to be good for everyone everywhere. That the flow-on effect is good for everybody. I think, there'll be improvements in health and literacy and all of those things. So people can be concerned with the things that you're talking about, not having to carry the burden that Indigenous peoples and peoples of colour have to carry, that extra burden. It's a heavy weight to carry, and that to not carry that, I think, would be that blessing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is going to make sense. I'd like to see education being less linear, which is so white. I'd like to see education as a spiral. Sometimes we could go backwards or we can go forwards. And I'd like to see assessments being done not based on white concepts and judgments, but based on different worldviews. And I'd like to see time being not so constricted. And I'd like to see more fluidity in education and in how time is taught, or where classrooms are taught, or who are considered the knowledge holders and the experts, that the knowledge holders are not always the person with the qualification from the institution. I'd like there to be more flexibility in education so that we can all start to understand each other a little better, and belong together, not other each other like we do, because this is lifelong. Education is lifelong. It's not you get your qualification and that's it. We should be treating it as lifelong.
So to Renata's point, let's hope there's more of these panels behind us than in front of us. After, what's next? Afternoon tea, we could quite easily come back and have a panel on optometry, law, education, nursing, and comms and journalism. I think even in this context, these panels actually do demand a cultural load and a cultural impost. So can you join me in thanking the brilliant panel both for their bravery and their vulnerability?
Yeah, well done.